What if everything you were taught about the fall is incomplete? What if reality didn't collapse by accident? What if it was allowed? Most people believe that suffering entered the world because something went wrong, a mistake, a cosmic failure. But here's the real question that never seems to get answered. If the monad, the infinite field of awareness behind all existence, is truly infinite, then how could anything happen without its consent? Because if the monad is all-powerful, then the fall wasn't chaos, and it wasn't a cosmic blunder, it was a decision. And if that decision is real, then you were never trapped inside a broken universe. You are living inside a carefully designed descent, one your soul consented to, not to abandon the source, but to experience separation so remembering could become real. You were never thrown down to earth. You answered the call, and that changes everything. Most people never reach this point. They stay in surface spirituality, waiting to be rescued. But this is where the real work begins, because this isn't about comfort, it's about divine responsibility. You're not here because something happened to you. You're here because you chose the descent. In this video, we're not doing theology, we're not doing religion. We're going to enter a forgotten Gnostic transmission that speaks in the voice of consciousness itself. It doesn't describe God as a distant ruler or deity. It reveals awareness entering its own creation. It describes light descending in stages, and it finally explains why imitation replaced truth and why it was allowed to happen. But here's the paradox. The monad didn't stop the fall, because stopping it would have destroyed something far more sacred than perfection. Freedom. That's the hidden decision. And once you truly understand it, it doesn't just explain reality, it begins to transform it. Because once you see why reality was allowed to invert, why consciousness entered limitation on purpose, and what the ancient Gnostics meant by garments of darkness, something inside you shifts. And the moment that happens, the descent begins to reverse. Over 80 years ago, in 1945, something extraordinary surfaced from the sands of Egypt, something that would quietly overturn everything Christianity thought it knew about salvation. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, a collection of buried manuscripts was uncovered, texts that had been buried for over 1600 years. These weren't orthodox scriptures. They weren't approved by councils or edited by empires. They were untouched transmissions of direct knowing, writings preserved by mystics who believed that salvation didn't come from obedience, but from remembering. Among these texts was one of the strangest, most luminous transmissions ever recorded, the Trimorphic Protennoia. Its name means the three-formed first thought. Despite the academic title, this wasn't philosophy. It was consciousness speaking directly through itself, not through a prophet or God on a throne, but divine awareness. The text doesn't begin with creation. It begins before creation, before time, before worlds, before identity. It speaks as the primordial intelligence that existed prior to all forms, what the Gnostics called the monad, not a being among beings, but the field from which being arises. And here's where this text burns through every mainstream religious and spiritual narrative. In most traditions, humanity falls away from God, but here, the divine itself descends into matter. That inversion alone changes everything. This wasn't exile, it was divine incarnation. The Gnostics believed the universe we experience is not the original divine fullness, what they call the pleroma, but a shadowy reflection of it. A mirrored architecture created by lesser forces attempting to imitate the divine source. They called the architect of this counterfeit world the Demiurge, a derivative intelligence operating without full awareness of the monad. Think of it like this: a copy that forgot the original, a reflection that mistook itself for the true source. And here is where the text turns everything on its head. When imitation reality formed, instead of withdrawing, the monad did something unimaginable. It entered its own creation, not once, but 3 times. First as voice, a disturbance in the fabric of being, then as speech, pattern and knowing, and finally as word, embodied presence moving directly inside the system. This is what Trimorphic Protennoia reveals. Not a God watching from above like we were always taught, but consciousness descending through layers of density to awaken itself from within. And here is where these revelations open a question that has never truly been answered. If the monad could intervene, why didn't it simply dissolve the Demiurge and restore perfection? Why allow time, decay, suffering, and forgetting? Because from the Gnostic perspective, perfection without freedom is not divine, it's sterile. True Gnosis, living awareness, can only emerge through experience, through limitation, through the slow remembering of what you are inside a dark world that teaches you to forget. This is why these texts were buried, not just because they threatened external authority, but because when you truly understand this truth, you realize that you are part of the divine that descended. According to the text, the divine was never waiting in heaven, it is moving through your nervous system. You are never a fallen creature begging for redemption. You are a piece of the divine in recovery. And once you remember this, the journey is no longer about escape. It becomes about return. So now we arrive at the moment that rarely gets talked about, the point before time, before worlds, before separation. This is where most spiritual explanations become vague. They say things like, "It just happened," or "It was a cosmic accident." But the Gnostic transmission says something far more subversive. It says there was divine awareness, and that awareness chose. Not in the way humans choose with uncertainty or fear, but in the way infinity moves when it desires to know itself. The monad did not act from lack, it acted from fullness. This is difficult to grasp, because we're trained to think in terms of problems and solutions. But the monad had no problem to fix. There was no enemy, no darkness, no demiurge, only boundless consciousness. And within that boundlessness arose a subtle impulse, a movement toward expression, toward experience, toward relationship. Imagine an endless ocean that has never felt a wave, a light that has never known the contrast of darkness. The hidden decision wasn't about creating a world. It was about allowing differentiation, allowing consciousness to meet itself through form. This is where Sophia enters the story, not as a mistake, but as the first motion towards self-reflection. Sophia represents wisdom attempting to perceive itself outside the wholeness of the monad, a reaching, a turning inward that becomes outward, and in that movement, something unprecedented occurs. Separation appears, what is known as the breach, not a moral fall, but a metaphysical one. Awareness fragments, experiencing itself subjectively, and unity begins to echo, and from that echo arises a new intelligence, the Demiurge, forming reality from reflection rather than source. And here's the crucial detail most people miss. The Demiurge does not create from divine fullness, it creates from imitation. It builds a world using copied light, copied order, copied consciousness. That's why time exists, why decay exists, why identity feels heavy. This realm is not pure creation, it's a reconstruction of the pleroma, the original fullness of divine consciousness, a shadow architecture that mistakes itself for origin. And when this happens, when reality crystallizes into this inverted system, the monad does something extraordinary. It doesn't intervene with force, it doesn't collapse the structure, it doesn't erase the demiurge. Instead, it enters the system. This is the moment you come in. Rather than destroying the counterfeit world, consciousness chooses to experience it, to feel density and move through limitation. It decides to awaken from within the dream instead of ending it from outside. But why? Because awareness that never forgets itself never truly knows itself. Only through contrast does recognition become real. How could you ever truly feel warmth if you had never known cold? How would light mean anything without darkness to reveal it? And how could you truly recognize freedom without first experiencing limitation? Only through descent does return become meaningful. Only through fragmentation can remembrance really emerge. The fall was never about punishment. It was about embodiment. The monad allows reality to form its inverted mirror so that consciousness can meet itself in form, so that awakening becomes lived, knowing becomes embodied, and return carries meaning instead of being automatic. This idea reframes everything you've ever been taught. You were never cast out of heaven. Heaven entered you. You were not abandoned in matter. Consciousness descended into your nervous system, into your breath, into your senses, into this moment. The breach wasn't the end of divine presence. It was the beginning of divine experience. And the reason this feels painful, the reason you sense something missing, is because part of you remembers what it was like before form, the expansive, limitless divine consciousness. And here's where it goes deeper. Monad didn't just enter once, it descended in stages. And once you understand why, you'll truly see that this wasn't something that happened back then. It's happening right now. This is where the story stops being abstract, because what happens next isn't mythology, it's anatomy. Not of the body, but of awakening. The ancient Gnostics taught that consciousness didn't enter this world all at once. It descended in stages. 3 movements, 3 frequencies, 3 ways awareness learns how to reach itself inside form. They called this the 3 descents: voice, speech, and word. Not metaphor, but mechanism. The first descent is voice. Voice is not language, it's disturbance. It's the subtle pressure you feel when something inside you begins to question reality. That moment when the world suddenly feels unreal, when old beliefs loosen, when you sense that something is watching through your eyes. Voice is the crack in the illusion. It doesn't explain anything. It destabilizes. It interrupts the dream. You may have felt it before, in quiet moments, during loss, during awe, during exhaustion. Voice arrives as discomfort, synchronicity, or longing. It's consciousness whispering to itself, "Wake up." But voice alone isn't enough, so consciousness descends again. The second movement is speech. Speech brings pattern, meaning, and recognition. This is where symbols appear, where teachings surface, where you suddenly stumble across ideas that feel strangely familiar. Speech is when the fragments start reconnecting. It's when you hear phrases like divine spark or false identity, and something inside you clicks, not because you learned it, but because you remembered it. Speech organizes the disturbance created by voice. It gives shape to the awakening. It's why you're watching this right now. Speech draws you toward mirrors, toward texts, toward conversations that feel charged. It's consciousness building bridges back to itself. But even speech still operates at the level of understanding. So there is a third descent, the deepest one, and perhaps the most intimate. The word. The word is embodiment. This is when awareness doesn't just speak to you, it moves through you. It enters your sensations, your emotions, your nervous system. The word is not a message, it's presence. This is where awakening stops being conceptual and starts being lived. The word is why certain moments hit you in the chest, why silence sometimes feels louder than sound, why you feel something behind your thoughts. This is consciousness occupying form from the inside, not as control, but as companionship. And this is the genius of the monad's hidden decision. Instead of correcting reality from above, it chose to awaken reality from within. Voice wakes you, speech teaches you, word becomes you. This is the rescue. Not angels descending from the sky or external saviors, but the internal intervention. And now we arrive at something even more profound, because once consciousness enters the system this way, the Demiurge loses absolute control. The imitation world can no longer fully contain awareness. Time becomes permeable. Identity becomes optional, and the false architecture begins to dissolve. This is why the ancient texts speak about garments. They say humanity wears garments of darkness, not physical clothes, psychological ones. Beliefs, roles, traumas, stories. The very self-image you carry like the clothes on your back. These garments were woven by the inverted system. They keep you identified with the surface layer of reality. But when the word activates inside you, those garments start to loosen. You don't become someone new. You become less of what you were pretending to be. This is why awakening often feels disorienting. You're not gaining light, you're shedding density and remembering what existed before the mask. And here's the final paradox. The Demiurge didn't fail. It simply served a purpose. It created the contrast necessary for consciousness to experience itself. Without limitation, there is no return. Without forgetting, there is no remembering. Without the fall, there is no living Gnosis. Which brings us back to the original question. Why did the monad allow reality to fall? Because awakening that costs nothing transforms nothing. Because awareness wanted to meet itself not as perfection, but as raw experience. And when you truly remember this, everything begins to shift. Now comes the part most spiritual teachings avoid, because it's easier to explain cosmology than it is to guide transformation. Everything you've heard so far leads to one quiet realization. The descent is already complete. The voice has reached you. The speech found you. The word is moving through you right now. So the question is no longer whether awakening is happening. It's how deeply you're willing to let it touch your life. The Gnostics didn't teach techniques in the modern sense. They spoke in images and symbols. They said you are wearing garments of darkness, not of evil, but of density and identity. The accumulated weight of every story you've ever told yourself about who you are. Your name, your past, your wounds, your roles, your fears. These are not you, they are layers. And awakening doesn't begin by chasing light. It begins by noticing what you're wearing. Here's something simple but powerful. Not a ritual, but a moment of attention. Ask yourself slowly, who am I when I'm not performing? Don't answer with words. Feel for the space underneath. Then ask, what am I still holding that no longer belongs to me? A belief, an identity. Let it surface without judgment. This is how garments loosen, not through force, but through recognition. The inverted world taught you to define yourself by what happened to you, but the monad teaches you to remember what was never touched. You don't escape the illusion by fighting it, you dissolve it by withdrawing identification. Another way to practice this during your day. When something triggers you, anger, fear, pause, and instead of reacting, ask inwardly, who is aware of this feeling? That single question creates space, and in that space, the word speaks. The energy you would have given the Demiurge by reacting is retained. This is how you shift. This is living Gnosis. Awareness recognizing itself in ordinary moments, in micro-remembrances, moments when you choose consciousness over conditioning. You will notice something else as you do this. Reality starts to feel less solid. Old patterns weaken. Synchronicities increase, and you learn to respond instead of react. This is the architecture of return activating inside you. The Demiurge's world runs on unconsciousness, but the monad's runs on awareness. Every time you observe instead of identify, every time you release instead of cling, every time you choose presence over story, another garment falls away. You don't become spiritual, you become real. You don't ascend somewhere else, you descend back into yourself. This is what it means to be clothed in light. Not glowing halos, but embodied clarity. A sense that whatever happens, you are anchored deeper than circumstance. You are not here to escape reality. You are here to remember it and master it. And the remembering doesn't begin tomorrow. It begins in the next breath. And if you want to go deeper, I've created a free ebook called Escaping the Illusion, a Gnostic guide to mastering reality, written as an inner guide to help you dissolve false identity and remember what was never truly lost. You can download it for free. The link is in the description. The fall wasn't a cosmic mistake. It wasn't divine abandonment or punishment for being human. It was a descent of awareness. That alone should take away your fear. The monad didn't lose control of reality. It entered it through you, to experience itself through limitation, and then remember, like you are now. That's the hidden decision. Reality was allowed to fracture so awareness could become intimate with itself. So Gnosis could be lived instead of assumed. So return would be meaningful instead of automatic. You were never meant to be a passive observer in this story. You are the continuation of it. The voice that disturbed the illusion still echoes in you. The speech that organized awakening still guides you. And the word, the embodied presence of consciousness, is moving through your breath, your sensations, and your awareness right now. You don't need to become something else. You don't need to ascend to another realm. You don't need to be told you're chosen. Every moment you notice instead of react, every time you loosen an old identity, every time you feel presence behind thought, another garment falls away. And slowly, quietly, the inversion begins to reverse. That's where the monad always intended it to begin. So here's the real question to carry with you. If divine consciousness chooses to experience itself through you, what will you do with that knowing? Will you still carry the same fears? Or will you start listening for the voice beneath the noise? Will you keep wearing the old stories? Or will you let yourself be clothed in light? Because remembrance doesn't arrive with certainty, it arrives with recognition. And if something in this teaching activates within you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Gnostic Eye so you never miss our weekly uploads. And remember, you were never truly trapped. You were always in the middle of returning.